Hi class, let's get started with our discussion on the urinary system. I'm going to break up this body system into two main recordings. We'll have one recording on the anatomy of the urinary system and one recording on the physiology of the urinary system. This first recording, part one, is going to focus on urinary system anatomy. So, let's dive in. If we look at the main organs of our urinary system, we're going to have a lot of two-fers and one-fers. We have two kidneys and two ureters. A kidney you can think of as the organ that filters the blood. And as it's filtering our blood, it's going to produce urine. This is where we make the urine. As their namesake implies, they are bean-shaped, particularly like a kidney bean. And the tube that will carry the urine from the kidney or away from the kidney is known as a ureter. These small tubes are going to have smooth muscle lining them, so they're muscular tubes, so that the urine hopefully will continually flow one direction. There will be some peristalsis in these ureters. This is one of the reasons why, even if you're hanging upside down, urine in most situations will not flow backwards back into your kidneys. Every once in a while, someone will have kidney reflux disease. That's a big deal. We'll talk about that later. And then finally, there's the urethra. There's the bladder. The bladder is going to receive the urine from the ureters and will store the urine until we're able to void it or micturate it from the body. Our urinary bladder is expandable. Well, something that's unique about the urinary bladder is it's one of the only places in the body where you'll find transitional epithelium. And this transitional epithelium aids the urinary bladder as it's stretching out. When we need to urinate or micturate, we will take urine from the urinary bladder and send it out of the body through a tube called the urethra. The urethra is significantly longer in men compared to women, or males compared to females, and it's going to carry urine from that urinary bladder outside of the body. Now, on your lab exam, I will accept urinary bladder when I talk about this bladder, but I will not accept bladder all by itself, because in our lab exam we need to be precise. There are gallbladders and there are urinary bladders. So on the lab exam, be specific, but in this PowerPoint presentation, since it's about the urinary system and not the digestive system, I am going to use the term bladder. So if we look at these structures of the urinary system, we'll start off with the kidneys, and then we have tubes called the ureters, two kidneys, two ureters, going to the urinary bladder, and then from the urinary bladder we have that small tube, that urethra, that will carry the urine out of the body. Directly on the top margin of our kidneys, we have the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands produce a hormone known as aldosterone, which helps to regulate the sodium ion and therefore the water content of our bodies. Supplying blood to our kidneys, we have the renal artery. Removing blood from our kidneys, we have the renal vein. The kidneys, as we mentioned, will produce the urine, step one. Step two, the ureters carry the urine to the urinary bladder. And then step three, it is stored in the urinary bladder until step four, we are ready to void or pass our urine through the urethra. What are some of the functions of our urinary system? Well, our urinary system will help us remove metabolic waste or excrete metabolic waste. These metabolic wastes are things that have been broken down within the liver and then need to get removed from our bloodstream. So, for example, let's say you take some Tylenol because you have a headache. That Tylenol is not going to remain in your body forever and ever and ever. It wears off because your liver is breaking down those Tylenol molecules, the acetaminophen molecules. And the byproducts, as your liver breaks it down, are going to be dumped into the bloodstream and then removed from your bloodstream with the kidneys and excreted from the body. Our urinary system helps us to maintain our water salt and acid-base balance. We have a variety of hormones. Aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone, ADH, or we have ANP, angionatritic peptide. These hormones all work together to help us maintain our water salt balance in different ways. We have maintenance of the acid-base balance. We can selectively remove acid from the bloodstream or remove bases from the bloodstream and dump it into the urine as we modify our blood's pH. Some hormones specifically associated with the urinary system include renin and erythropoietin. Renin helps to regulate blood pressure. Erythropoietin helps to regulate red blood cell count. And then finally, we can have reabsorbed nutrients from our urine. Sometimes stuff makes it into our urine that we don't necessarily want in our urine, and we can remove it, we can suck it out of the urine before the urine's voided from the body. Some of those things could include glucose or amino acids or ATP, or other vitamins and minerals. One vitamin in particular that is linked to the urinary system is the synthesis of vitamin D. Let's talk about excretion. Excretion is when we are going to remove the waste product from the bloodstream. Most of these waste products that we excrete or remove from the bloodstream are going to be nitrogenous wastes. Of those nitrogenous wastes, we have urea, uric acid, and creatine. Urea is a byproduct from the breakdown of amino acids within our liver. There is a process where we can either change one amino acid into another amino acid called transamination, or we could go through ketolysis reactions where we break down the amino acids we use those amino acids to make cellular energy, ATP. And either of those processes, we can produce some waste urea products. We also have uric acid. Uric acid is closely related to urea. It's a few atoms different. Uric acid is primarily produced by the breakdown of nucleotides, DNA and RNA. ATP is a nucleotide, but that breakdown of ATP doesn't necessarily produce uric acid. Uric acid is one of the things that is associated with the nasty urine smell. There's also, ironically, high concentrations of uric acid in human sweat, and it's one of the reasons why sweaty gym clothes smell so bad. We also have creatine. Creatine is a protein that's present in our muscle cells. It's specific, and we can use this creatine to store extra ATP molecules. When creatine is storing extra ATP, it will oscillate back and forth between being a creatine and a creatine phosphate molecule. We will sometimes, as we're working out really hard, tear our muscle fibers or muscle cells, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. A good workout, particularly a good strength training or running regimen, will do that for us, and we will have a little bit of creatine enter into the bloodstream. Depending on the kind of creatine that enters the bloodstream, it can be related to a specific kind of muscle type. There is creatine that's only present in cardiac muscle cells or heart muscle cells. And if that creatine makes it into the bloodstream, that is associated with a heart attack or myocardial infarction, where there's going to be cardiac muscle cell death. We never want to have the cardiac creatine or the heart associated creatine in our bloodstream. That's terrible. That typically means you're dying. But if we have creatine associated with skeletal muscle fibers or skeletal muscle cells in our bloodstream, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we have low concentrations, usually that means you had one heck of an awesome workout. If you have sky-high concentrations of skeletal muscle creatine in your bloodstream, then we have to look at what happened to your body. Was your leg crushed in a car accident? Or what would cause very high numbers of your muscle cells to be lysing or popping at the same time? If we look at objectives 2 and 3, the maintenance of water, salt, and acid-base balance of our bodies. These are going to both be homeostatic mechanisms, and these are in particular are going to be negative feedback homeostatic mechanisms. The water-salt balance helps to maintain blood pressure. If I put more salt or mineral ions in my bloodstream, I am going to increase the osmotic pressure or the concentration of dissolved salts in my bloodstream. And as I have more dissolved salts in my bloodstream, I will have more water sucked into my bloodstream via osmosis. And the more liquid I put in my blood, the more volume it takes up and the higher my blood pressure becomes. On the flip side, if my blood pressure is too high, I want to remove fluid from my bloodstream, and I can do that by removing the salts from my bloodstream and then minimizing the amount of water that's sucked into the bloodstream via osmosis. Our kidneys, in particular, can remove hydrogen ions directly. Recall, the more hydrogen ions you have dissolved in solution, the more acidic your solution becomes. So because our kidneys can remove the hydrogen ions from the blood and dump it into the urine, we can excrete the hydrogen ions. So when I say excrete hydrogen, I mean we are going from the blood to the urine. The kidneys can excrete the hydrogen ions and make the blood less acidic. We can raise the pH. Another thing we can use to raise the pH and make the blood more basic is reabsorb bicarbonate ions from the bloodstream. Generally speaking, we want our blood pH to be anywhere between 7.35 and 7.45. So usually there's a happy medium of a blood pH of 7.4. Very slightly basic. If we look at some of the hormones associated with the urinary system, those hormones include renin. Renin is going to be secreted by the kidneys, and it will allow for the adrenal glands to secrete more aldosterone. So in order to secrete aldosterone, we need to first have renin being secreted by the kidneys. Then renin travels to the adrenal glands and causes the adrenal glands to secrete aldosterone, and then aldosterone is going to cause our kidneys to reabsorb more salt, more specifically, reabsorb more sodium ions. Aldosterone makes us reabsorb sodium ions, and as we reabsorb those sodium ions into our bloodstream, we will then, through osmosis, suck up more water from the urine and dump it into the blood and raise our blood pressure. So, in response to low blood pressure, our kidneys secrete renin, and then the renin goes to the adrenal gland, and then the adrenal glands secrete aldosterone, and then aldosterone makes us reabsorb sodium, which then causes more water to go into the bloodstream and the blood pressure to go back up again. If we look at erythropoietin, this is a hormone that's going to stimulate the production of red blood cells. The abbreviation for erythropoietin is EPO. Erythropoietin is going to be secreted by the kidneys when we have a low blood oxygen level. In response to low blood oxygen, our kidneys will secrete EPO to make the red bone marrow make more red blood cells. Why would we want more red blood cells if we have low blood oxygen? We would want more red blood cells because red blood cells carry oxygen in the bloodstream. The more red blood cells we have, the more oxygen we can transport in our blood, and the higher our blood oxygen concentrations will be. Now, everything needs to be in moderation. If you have too much EPO released, you'll produce too many red blood cells and your blood becomes too thick. So that's one of the major dangers associated with blood doping with EPO. If you increase your EPO concentrations by traveling to Colorado and working out in Denver where there's lower oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere, or if you go on lots of anaerobic exercise, long runs and long bike rides, that can moderately raise your red blood cell concentration and help you perform at higher levels, athletically speaking, but won't necessarily get you up into the range where your blood becomes too thick and too viscous and put you at risk of heart attack. We can also reabsorb nutrients with our urinary system. We will reabsorb many of those filtered nutrients. As I mentioned before, we can have amino acids reabsorbed, glucose, ATP, and specific minerals that we can reabsorb from our urine and dump back into our bloodstream as we need to maintain blood homeostasis. We can also have calcium reabsorption from our urine. Vitamin D is a twofer. It promotes calcium reabsorption from the digestive tract and the urinary tract as well. So in addition to the calcium digestive tract, vitamin D will help us reabsorb calcium from the digestive tract and urinary tract. As we look at our urinary bladder, you can think of it as a big storage bag. Simply put, we just store urine in it. It's not necessarily the most convenient thing in the world to have a slow, steady stream of urine dripping down our legs. That would be a great way to have skin and tissue breakdown on the surface of our private parts and our inner thighs. So we store urine in our urinary bladder until it's convenient for us to release it, void it, or micturate it. We have two sphincters, which are circular muscles that keep the urinary bladder closed. And lining our urinary bladder, we're going to have lots of smooth muscle fibers, and they are in two layers. One wrapping around the circumference of the urinary bladder, and another one wrapping around the longitudinal axis of the urinary bladder. So you can think of these two layers of smooth muscle fibers as crisscrossing each other or in opposite directions as they wrap around this urinary bladder. We also have that transitional epithelium that lines the urinary bladder. This allows for the expansion of the mucosal membrane inside of the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is one of the few spots in the body where we can find this transitional epithelium. Right now, to be honest, I would be hard-pressed to come up with another spot in the body that has transitional epithelium. There probably is another spot. I just can't think of it right now. And then finally, as we go through the process of filling our urinary bladder, we have stretch receptors within our urinary bladder that send signals to the spinal cord. And as the urinary bladder stretches out more and more and more, this involuntary reflex to urinate becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. This involuntary reflex is called the micturition reflex, or the urination reflex. And this reflex, as it becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, will eventually overpower our higher brain centers and say, I don't care, you need to urinate right now. And that's when somebody wets their pants, usually. Thankfully, most of the time, we are able to make it to the bathroom before this micturition reflex becomes so strong that we can no longer overpower it with our higher brain functions. So as we look at the control of the urinary bladder, we have two systems or two networks in place. We are going to have spinal cord pre-processing sections, and we're also going to have processing in the brain. The processing in the spinal cord is going to initiate the involuntary urination reflex. In particular, it can cause the internal sphincter of our urinary bladder to relax. So as the internal sphincter of the urinary bladder relaxes, we're going to have increased pressure on the external urinary sphincter. This external urinary sphincter is made of skeletal muscle, so we can have voluntary control over it. The internal sphincter of the urinary bladder is made of smooth muscle tissue, so we don't have voluntary control over it. So, class, which of the following is not a function of the urinary system? This is a concept check question, so you can go ahead and rewind the video to get me an answer, or you can pause it, check your notes, check your textbook, or check the PowerPoints that you printed off. We have A, excretion of metabolic waste, B, maintenance of water-salt balance, C, maintenance of acid-base balance, D, regulation of white blood cell count, E, hormone secretion, or F, reabsorbed filtered nutrients. So pause the video and get me an answer right meow. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, class, the correct answer is D, regulation of white blood cell count. Our urinary bladder, urinary system does not regulate white blood cell count directly. It does regulate red blood cell count directly, as it's monitoring blood oxygen concentration and will release EPO to stimulate the production of more red blood cells. But that's red blood cells only. EPO, erythropoietin, does not affect white blood cell production. Moving on, we have section 2 from chapter 11. The structures of our urinary system. If we look at our kidneys are going to be broken up into 3 broad regions. We have the outer layer of granulated tissues. This is known as the renal cortex. We have the middle layer that has many renal pyramids or cone-shaped masses in it. This is known as the renal medulla. And then we have the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is a central cavity in the very center of the kidney that collects the urine and is continuous with the ureters that carries the urine away from the urinary bladder. So here in a broad overview or structure of the kidney, we have around the circumference that I'm tracing, the renal cortex, and then these triangular structures all combined to make up the renal medulla, and then in the very center, we have a renal pelvis. Here is a snapshot of the section of a renal cortex with a renal pyramid into the renal pelvis. And you can see that there are lots of tubes that go from one region of the kidney to the next region and then to the final region of the kidney. If we were looking at an actual human kidney that was sliced, and oh, this is a very fresh kidney that was sliced, you can see beautifully here the renal cortex on the outside with those renal pyramids that make up the medulla, and then the renal pelvis right in the center. I should also point out, while looking at this kidney, that there is almost no fat on this kidney that's been dissected. Man, the person whose kidney this belonged to, this was one lean individual. Almost every kidney you dissect is going to have lots and lots of fat embedded within it. If we look at the kidney, the structural and functional unit of the kidney, the thing that does the filtering in the kidney is called a nephron. And there are millions of nephrons per kidney. When we look at these tubes that are wrapping around from the cortex down into the renal pyramid and that connect to the renal pelvis, those tubes each represent an individual nephron. Zooming in on the nephron, there's you can see that there's a large capsule that blood will flow into, and then there's a twisty tube followed by a long dipping tube, followed by another twisty tube, and then followed by another long dipping tube. This first capsule that the blood will flow into is called a renal corpuscle or glomerular capsule. And in the center of this glomerular capsule, we have a capillary bed known as the glomerulus. And this glomerulus, this capillary bed, is a special capillary bed that's very leaky. Lots of liquid can leak out of the bloodstream at the glomerulus. And then that liquid will move through these twisty tubes and become processed and turn into urine. The first twisty tube, the one that's closest to the renal corpuscle, is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's closest to the point of attachment, convoluted because it's twisty, and tubule because, well, it's a tube. And after the proximal convoluted tubule, that filtrate, that stuff that's been removed from the bloodstream, has lots of substances removed from it, and then we go through the loop of nephron, formerly called the loop of Henle, and as we go through this descending and ascending tube or loop, we'll have more substances removed from the filtrate, and then we get up to the distal convoluted tubule, and at the distal convoluted tubule up here, we'll have more processing of the filtrate until we get to the collecting duct, and in the collecting duct, typically we're going to have lots of water removed from the filtrate, and once it exits the collecting duct, we are going to call that filtrate urine. And notice that the proximal and convoluted tubules, generally speaking, are up in the renal cortex, but the loop of Henle, the loop of nephron is the current name for the structure. The loop of nephron is typically going to be within the renal medulla. So that glomerulus, those capillaries, are where we have lots of liquid leaking out of the blood. That's called the filtrate. This filtrate is going to be turned into urine. That proximal convoluted tubule has lots of reabsorption, particularly of particularly of ATP, glucose, and amino acids, those really important nutrients. And to increase or maximize the rate of absorption, we have a lot of microvilli in a brush border within the proximal convoluted tubule. Those microvilli increase surface area and maximize reabsorption. The loop of the loop of nephron. Can you tell that I'm a little crusty? I learned many of the old school names for these structures. Anyways, the loop of nephron is that U-shaped structure that goes from the proximal convoluted tubule, starting here, down into the medulla and back up into the cortex. As it goes down into the medulla and back up again, it's going to go through varying tissues that have varying concentrations of salt, and this is going to cause more salt to be removed from the filtrate. On the descending limb, we're going to have lots of water leave, and on the ascending limb, we have lots of salt leaving. With our distal convoluted tubule, we'll have epithelial cells that have lots and lots of mitochondria in them. The reason we have lots and lots of mitochondria in those epithelial cells is they are going to be moving stuff against, or chemicals against their concentration gradients. We're going to have lots of tubular secretion. And this tubular secretion, this moving of chemicals against their concentration gradients, requires the input of energy, hence the use of mitochondria, or these mitochondria-rich cells, because mitochondria are the energy plants or the power plants of the cell, making that ATP. And then finally, multiple nephrons merge at the collecting duct, and that collecting duct is going to carry the filtrate to the renal pelvis, where it will be collected and sent out of the kidney. And depending on who you check with, as we go from the distal convoluted tubule to the collecting duct, some texts will call that the transition from filtrate to urine. Other texts will call the transition from the collecting duct to the renal pelvis the transition from filtrate to urine. It is not a black and white transition. In terms of the chemical composition of the filtrate as it goes from filtrate to being urine, it's a gradual transition. Class, concept check here. Which of the part of the nephron has the most reabsorption of nutrients taking place? Is it the glomerular capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of nephron, distal convoluted tubule, or the collection duct or collecting duct? Go ahead and rewind the video, check your textbook, check your PowerPoints, or check your notes. Please get me an answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is B, proximal convoluted tubule. Our proximal convoluted tubule has the most reabsorption because it has the highest surface area thanks to these microvilli that are present within the proximal convoluted tubule. To look at the figure again, the proximal convoluted tubule is the tube that directly comes off of the renal corpuscle and carries the filtrate that is the most similar in composition to the blood plasma. If you have any questions for me about the urinary system anatomy, please feel free to post me a note on the class discussion board. You can shoot me an email or swing by my office when you're on campus. Happy studies!